work in War and Peace began at a time when it looked like the earth was going to explode. People were building fallout shelters in America, and children were being taught to duck under their desks in case of nuclear attack. I had a newly won PhD and was working as a mathematician. I decided to give that up, see what I could do, and I joined a War and Peace Institute, the Hun Sen Institute. I spent 2 years there, and most important, at that time, I had an idea. And I want to talk about how this idea progressed into the success and failure of 3 ideas that reached Washington-Moscow summits on missile defense. This is 3 of 5 of my ideas that reached Washington and Moscow summits. So in 1963, I was working at the Hun Sen Institute. That's me, this callow youth, and that's my boss, Donald Brennan. And at that time, the Russians were building a small missile defense around a city called Tallinn. And I had this idea while in an attic in Elmsford, why don't we talk them out of it? We could tell them if they build one, we'll build a bigger one. And it would be a waste of money. These missile defenses were not perfect. They couldn't shoot down all the missiles aimed at them. And if they got good at it, the other side would build still more missiles. So the whole thing would be wasteful and dangerous, another overlay of the arms race. So I began writing papers about this. And this was such a new idea that my boss here, Donald Brennan, sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense saying he should look into this before Stone's ideas reached the Russians. Eventually, 10 years later, this treaty banning the missiles on each side was agreed. But in between that time, I discovered that my paper was so interesting to some Americans, high-ranking Americans and Russians, were having a sort of secret meeting in Cambridge, and they were interested in using my paper on missile defense. They offered me the equivalent of $10,000. I said I'd rather present the paper myself. They could keep the money. And I was admitted to this group. It included Henry Kissinger, who was eventually the National Security Advisor and for President Nixon. It included Jerome Wiesner, who was the science advisor to President Kennedy. It included another man who became the chief Soviet expert to the Secretary of State Vance. These were very important men, and they were having private meetings with high-ranking Russians to see what they could do about the arms race. So I presented my paper there. It was quite successful. The Russians denounced it. They said defenses were very important and you couldn't be against defenses. But it was clear that they understood the idea. Henry Kissinger had told them a joke about a Russian sheriff, a Texas sheriff, who was beating communists. And one person looked up and said, "Don't beat me, I'm anti-communist." And the sheriff said, "We don't care what kind of communist you are," and continued to beat him. And when the Russians came down the next morning, they said, "Stone, you're just like that Texas sheriff. You don't care, missiles, anti-missiles, you beat them all." So I realized they had got the idea, and they began to try to spread it around inside Moscow. So for 5 years, they encouraged me to learn Russian, and I encouraged my wife to learn Russian. And for 5 years, we went to Russia every year in the summers and passed out books and articles I'd written on this subject. Some of them we had translated into Russian, and lobbied them to open negotiations with the United States on missile defense. And by this time, during these 5 years, a lot of people were promoting this idea, including Secretary McNamara and Lyndon Johnson. A lot of people were in on it, but I always considered it my idea. And the Russians were calling it Jeremy Stone's proposal right along from 1967. So eventually this idea did succeed. Henry Kissinger's administration, Nixon and Brezhnev, signed the treaty. Kissinger had mocked me at Harvard when I was writing books there. He had said, "Stone thinks missile defense is so weak it won't work, but it's so strong it'll be destabilizing." which I thought was a brilliant summary of my position, but which he thought was a slur. But in the end, he said those anti-missile defense people knew what they were talking about, and he negotiated the treaty. So this was a success. Now, 12 years later, you can see that ideas can need continuing work. President Reagan proposed Star Wars, an impregnable missile defense that would protect the country completely. And he didn't discuss his idea with his Secretary of State or his Secretary of Defense or his National Security Advisor, but he did it on the advice of Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb. And this created a big furor. The next day I was on television 8 times trying to explain that a missile defense wasn't like landing on the moon. Landing on the moon wasn't such a big problem because the moon didn't duck around to prevent the astronauts from landing. But with missile defense, it was different. The Russians were not going to hold still for this, and the arms race would speed up. Now, this proposal for a Star Wars defense of President Reagan created consternation in Russia. I invented an idea to try to resolve the problem. I published an article in the Washington Post called the Bear Hug Strategy. And I went to Moscow and gave a lecture. 40 important people attended, and it was videotaped, I think, for Gorbachev. The idea was that the Russians should say, we'll throw away lots of missiles, if you will too. We'll engage in massive missile disarmament. But if you wreck the ABM treaty that's already been agreed, of course we will have to stop the disarmament because we'll need more missiles to penetrate your missile defense. So 3 weeks later, Gorbachev had accepted this idea in a speech he gave, and on my return to Washington, I met with this man, Paul Nitze, a super hawk in the State Department, chief advisor in the State Department, but one who had respect for me. And I said, Paul, here's what I've done in Russia. This same idea would really work for you. You can tell the Senate, without spending a dime, I got the Russians to engage in massive disarmament. And so we don't really need this missile defense. We're having disarmament, and this will work on both sides. So he thought this was a good idea. And he persuaded the Secretary of State, and they persuaded the National Security Advisor. And they decided to persuade President Reagan to sign off on this. They conspired. They said to themselves, if we just tell President Reagan this is a small thing to hand to Gorbachev at the summit, then he'll just shrug and sign it. And so they did that, and he did that. He shrugged and signed it. So this is how my idea got to the summit between Reagan and Gorbachev. And eventually, this idea was agreed and saved the problem of Star Wars. Another 12 years passed, and the second George Bush administration decided they wanted to tear up the treaty. So this was another crisis in the life of the ABM treaty. I had an idea for resolving this, went to the White House and talked to this man, Steve Hadley, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor. And I said, Steve, if the Russians agree to let you test all you want for Star Wars, would you agree not to tear up the ABM treaty? He said, the trouble with this idea is it's too good an idea. We want to tear up the treaty, and this would make it impossible for us to do it. We can't do anything but test during the next 5 years, so it doesn't interfere with our program, but it would be hard to explain to people why we're tearing up the treaty. So he said, don't tell the Russians that we would agree to this because we won't. So I said, okay. I went home. 3 weeks later, before a planned trip to Moscow, I got a call from the White House. It was Steve Hadley. He said, well, I've talked to Condoleezza Rice. He was the Deputy National Security Advisor. She was the National Security Advisor. She said, oh, Jeremy's trying to put us in a box. I said, you know, Steve, I'm not trying to do that. He said, don't worry. She was laughing. And, but we talked it over, and we probably wouldn't agree with this. So I was startled. I'm used to working on intractable problems. They had gone from we won't agree to this to we probably won't agree to this. So for me, this was a kind of an open door, and I went to Moscow and proposed this idea to Mamedov, who was the deputy foreign minister in the foreign ministry. This was the day of 9/11, but 9/11 Moscow time didn't occur till 5 p.m., and we were talking at 9 in the morning. And he said, well, this is a great idea. we'll try this out on Bolton and see what happens. Well, Putin came to Washington and went to the Texas ranch, and the night before he got there, Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, actually proposed my idea to the Russians. She did it in a very manly way. She did the contrapositive of what I said. She said, if you don't let us test, we will tear up the treaty. So this was a much more robust way of putting it, but it was exactly the same thing I had proposed. And the Russians said, okay, but we want to see each test, know about each test before we agree to it. And when Secretary Rumsfeld was told about this, he said never. And so the treaty was torn up. But by this time, it was 2001, and the arms race was over, the Cold War was over, so the ABM Treaty had served its purpose for 30 years. Now, I want to talk about my effort to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. I tried a number of things, many of which failed. There are lessons in how they failed. I want to explain what the situation was during the Cold War that led to such risks of the destruction of civilization itself. You see, here are the Russians, here are the Eastern European countries that they had invaded and were suppressing, they had gotten control of after World War II, and here's Western Europe. From a geographical point of view, Western Europe is just the end of the Eurasian Peninsula, and there's not a lot of room to fight a war. It was believed from the 40s through the 50s that the Russians had massive forces and that they might well invade. From the very beginning, the American strategy was, if you do that, we will bomb Russia. So that's what it meant when Eisenhower and Dulles, President Eisenhower and Secretary of State Dulles, said, we will retaliate with massive retaliation at a place and time of our own choosing. It meant you invade Western Europe and we will bomb you with strategic bombs carrying nuclear weapons. This became a more difficult thing to imagine as the Russians built their own nuclear bomb and put it on bombers and later on missiles. And so the problem arose, what if we bombed them and they bombed us back? So it became harder to imagine this strategy actually being carried out. In order to do something about this incredibility, some people, Henry Kissinger was one as a professor, urged that tactical nuclear weapons be put here in front of a possible invasion of the Russians so that the tactical nuclear weapons could offset what was imagined to be the superiority of the Russians. It wasn't realized at that time how poor and broke Russia was. They had lost 1 person in 10 during the war. Half the people were living in outhouses. They were terribly afraid of war at that time, but we weren't that aware of it. The trouble with the tactical nuclear weapons was that if they went off, there'd be no way to tell the difference between tactical or strategic nuclear weapons, and there would be a general nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. So tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe were a spark that would have ignited a nuclear war generally. So the question was what to do about that, and my first idea was that this decision should not be left to one person, and that the Congress should play some role in this. So we persuaded the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Fulbright, to add an amendment to the War Powers Bill. We basically said the War Powers Bill controls presidential war powers, and there's no more important war power than setting off a tactical nuclear weapon in Europe, because this will lead immediately to general nuclear war. It shouldn't be done on the advice of just one person. He should have to consult in some way with Congress. So Senator Fulbright put an amendment into the War Powers Bill saying Congress should maintain control over the nuclear or conventional character of the war. But this was defeated 68-10. We then began thinking about the fact that Congress was too unwieldy to be consulted as a whole, and that it needed a committee of high-ranking chairmen of relevant committees that he could consult with privately and secretly and quickly. The war wouldn't be over in a day or two, and he could consult with the senators before ordering the use of tactical nuclear weapons. We tried several times to get this going. Finally, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and this man, Majority Leader Mansfield, implemented our proposal. And on the front page of the Congressional Record, he listed the same people we wanted to have on this committee. We had by that time said Congress needs this committee not just for nuclear use, but for biological warfare, any kind of crisis. Congress should have a crisis committee, so he created it. But it only lasted for 2 years. The congressmen weren't that interested in taking responsibility for actions. They wanted to complain about them afterwards, but not so interested in taking responsibility. So I moved on to whether it was constitutional for the president by himself to order the first use of nuclear weapons in Europe. And I wrote a paper called, an article published in Foreign Policy magazine called Presidential First Use is Unlawful. This article was put up for a prize, and it quoted President Jefferson saying, I can do whatever I need to do in cases of war and peace, but I can't do more than I need to without consulting the Congress. If I have time to consult the Congress, I should do it, because it's not, war and peace is not just up to the president. So quoting Jefferson and writing a long article about this, I started a debate on the constitutionality of first use by one person. So constitutional lawyers convened at a weekend Airlie House conference, here they are, and debated whether Congress could work through a committee. There was a case called the CATALYTIC case, which suggested they couldn't do it for domestic issues, but whether they could do it for foreign policy issues and in emergencies had not really been decided. Well, the liberals among the constitutional lawyers agreed with me that presidential first use was unlawful without consultation with congressional elders, but the conservatives did not. So that put an end to 3 approaches to trying to prevent first use by one decision maker. I then discovered that the United Nations had had asked the question to the World Court, could it ever be legal to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances? And I parachuted into that debate. I wrote an op-ed, an amicus brief to the World Court. There they are, these justices in The Hague. This amicus brief was very interesting to them. They actually, for the first time in 50 years, sat to consider whether to make this part of the official record. They had never done this for, I think, once before, 50 years before. Normally, they just filed amicus briefs away and ignored them. But I had a proposal. I said, for the World Court, they should say that all weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear, they were all illegal. This is the high rhetoric appropriate for the International Court, but it should be understood as a contract. That was what was done in World War I, when poison gas was considered unlawful. But it was stockpiled on both sides, and it was understood that if one side did it, the other side would do it too. So my amicus brief said, that's what you ought to do. Call the whole thing illegal. It'll prevent first use, but it won't prevent second use. So if anybody uses it first, it wouldn't be illegal for you to retaliate, in which case you could still have your deterrence. You could still say, if you attack me, I'll bomb you back. But you couldn't do first use. So this was my idea. And I published it in the International Herald Tribune, and I invented another idea why first use was unlawful under international law. I had an argument that so many countries were not threatening it, that by customary law, it was international law that first use was unlawful. Well, the judges reached a very contested decision. The decision was so Delphic that nobody really understood what it meant. And the next week in Washington, 150 international lawyers sat before a panel to discuss what is the meaning of this decision. On the panel was the guy who had testified before the court for the Pentagon and the guy who had testified before the court on the State Department. And I realized that actually none of them really understood what the decision meant. I had wanted it to mean a ban on first use, but it didn't. They all thought it did. And that was because they had misunderstood one word where a "the" and an "a" made all the difference. I had the honor of standing up after this discussion by the panel saying all you guys are wrong. Unfortunately for me, it doesn't ban first use. The court had done something that judges do in difficult cases, and that is they gave the rhetoric to one side and they gave the decision to another. The effort to use the World Court also failed, but very narrowly. Now, there's another kind of first use that was still in place and which I was trying to prevent. This idea of Dulles and Eisenhower lives on even today. As it became more difficult to imagine disarming the Soviet Union or Russia from nuclear weapons, the option to do that remained in the war plans. And I know a few years ago in Washington, I confronted the Secretary of Defense. I said, you just gave a speech saying extended deterrence 3 times. Do you realize what that means? The Cold War is over, 20 years. This is a doomsday machine. Extended deterrence meant if something goes wrong in Eastern Europe, we retain the option to bomb Russia and try to disarm it, bombing all of its nuclear weapons, its missiles, its bombers, its submarines. This option, which probably no president would ever use, and which seemed completely inconsistent with the fact that the Cold War was over and we weren't going to launch this attack because of the Ukraine or something else, should be abandoned. And I believe the Secretary of Defense, Gates, who knew me from other things, as you'll see, made an effort to get rid of it. But changing the war plans is not easy. We retained war plans against the British, who burnt down the Capitol in 1812, until 1935. These war plans live on forever. So you're living in a country that has war plans to try to disarm the Soviet Union or Russia. You know, during this whole Cold War period, the Russians never had the ability to disarm the United States. We had Polaris submarines, and they were still playing catch-up in nuclear weapons, and there was no way they could disarm us. But we retained an option to disarm them. And from the point of view of people like me, Secretary McNamara, other people, it was dangerous. Because if somebody ever used it, tried to do it, it would just lead to general nuclear war. It wasn't likely to succeed, but in an emergency, might have been tried. So I had an idea for doing something about this. I heard that the Prime Minister of Russia was coming to see Clinton. There he is, Stepashin. He was Yeltsin's Prime Minister. There's BJ, my wife, and there's me. And I heard he was coming to Washington. I flew to Moscow. I wrangled a meeting with him. He started talking. I interrupted him, and I said, look, I have an idea for you. This is what you should tell President Clinton. And I explained my idea, which was, the Americans wanted a small ABM to defend against North Korea. It was prohibited by the ABM Treaty. I said, look, I'm the founder of this ABM Treaty, and it would be okay to let them have this ABM system, a small one for North Korea, so long as the nuclear forces on the two sides were at equal levels. If the nuclear forces on the two sides were at equal levels, it wouldn't be possible for the United States to implement this first strike strategy. So Russia would be safer, the world would be safer, and the Americans could have their ABM. He said, this is a great idea. What can I do for you? I said, I would like a picture. He said, okay, and I'm going to wear your button. I had a button which summarized my position. It said, truncate the sword and the shield becomes harmless. He said, okay, and this is for the Washington Post. I'll wear your button. And here's where I made a mistake. Anyway, I went to Washington, made 50 copies of this picture, started distributing it around the State Department. I said, I know you guys don't take me too seriously, but the Prime Minister is coming on Friday. He's got my idea. Look at this picture. He's wearing my button. You better start studying this. And so I briefed all the high officials in the State Department. And I didn't take the picture to the Washington Post. I thought this might destabilize the negotiations. When Prime Minister came and left and nothing happened, I was astonished. A year later, I saw this Prime Minister. He was no longer Prime Minister in Moscow. I said, what happened? with my idea. He said, oh, I proposed it to Clinton in the White House one-on-one, and he said, it's a good idea. Unfortunately, Gore is running for president, and he doesn't want any trouble. So that was the end of this idea, which means timing is critical. But I have to admit that Clinton was, I think, dissembling somewhat. They didn't want to fight with the Pentagon over this, and although this disarmament would have made this option to launch a first strike go away, I think they felt that the Pentagon would put up a fight about this, especially the Strategic Air Command. So they didn't want to fight over an option. So that's why timing is critical. Gore was running for president, and he didn't want any trouble. Now, during these 40 years of Cold War, I tried to do something in other methods to try to lower the risk of nuclear war. I tried political exchange, scientific cooperation, human rights, CIA, KGB cooperation, a number of things. First, I learned something about what happens to Americans when they go to Russia, or Westerners when they go to Russia. For 200 years, when Westerners went to Russia, two things were quite predictable. The hawks came back tranquilized. They said, we never realized how poor Russia was and how little a threat it really was. They're so backward. The doves would come back alarmed. They would say, we didn't realize Russia was so totalitarian, so dishonest, and so corrupt. So we waged a campaign which was summarized as fear them less and trust them less, and started to try and get congressmen and senators to visit Russia. I tried this for 16 years and failed until a group of women saved me. So I wanted to discuss what happened. First, I took this senator, Mike Gravelle, who was a new senator from Alaska. I took him to Moscow. He thought this is a great idea. He introduced a bill that would pay the way of all congressmen and senators and their wives, and 50 governors and their wives, and 100 mayors and their wives, for the price of one missile, to see what Russia was really like. This got very favorable reviews before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but the Nixon-Kissinger administration killed the bill. They didn't want the congressmen and senators getting into the action. They wanted to control the foreign policy, so they vetoed the idea. Now, I tried to get these senators and congressmen to go pretty frequently, several other efforts over about 15 years. Finally, a woman who was a friend of mine, this woman right here, Ann Hoops, and the wife of a distinguished foreign policy official, Pentagon official, she said to me once, she said, you know, we have this foreign policy group of women here. Is there anything we can actually do besides just study the problem? So I said, yeah, why don't you go door to door to all the congressional offices and knock on the door and say, has your congressman or senator ever been to Russia? When they say no, which virtually all of them will say, ask them, why don't you go? A lot of money's being spent on this, a lot of risks of war, find out what's happening, be good for you. And they made cookies and flowers, and they held parties for congressmen and senators. It was amazing. They got 20 senators to come to one meeting. Pretty soon, delegations start going. Eventually, the Russian embassy called me up and said, Stone, call off your dogs. We've taken 26 congressional delegations, and we can't take any more. So that was a success. Women power really worked. It never would have worked otherwise. Now, another lesson is to seize chances to expand ideas. And I want to talk about the start of CIA, KGB cooperation. This is Robert Gates. As you know, he was Secretary of Defense, and before that, head of the CIA, and before that, deputy head of the CIA. When he was deputy head of the CIA, he gave a talk at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And he was an expert in Russia, so he was talking about Russia. After he finished, he said, I'll take questions now, no matter how irreverent. So I said, well, I have an irreverent question. None of us would take sex education lessons from a virgin, no matter how well-informed that virgin was. So what I want to know is, have you ever been to Russia? Have you ever had intercourse with the Russian people? So Gates gave a long answer, which ended with no. So I said, well, how many other experts on Russia in the CIA are virgins also? And the man running the talk said, we're not, who was a former CIA person himself, we're not taking any more questions that denigrate the Central Intelligence Agency. So I went up to Gates afterwards and I said, look, I'm in the business of trying to get senators and congressmen to see what Russia's really like. I can get you invited. Would you go? So he gave me a kind of a gray answer. I told this funny story, sent a letter to the Russian embassy and said he should be invited. I got back an immediate answer. And the answer was the highest level in Russia, which was Gorbachev at the time, definitely will invite him. And he can come in the following different ways, you know, incognito, formally, we don't care. And please tell the CIA how he could come. So I sent a message over there. I didn't work for them. And so I'd only been there once when Jim Woolsey was sworn in. But I sent them a letter, and Gates was deputy head of the CIA. He was very interested in this. So I started thinking about the implications of this, and I started realizing that this could be really big. The CIA and the KGB had a lot of common interests. They were all against nonproliferation. They were against international crime. They were against drug smuggling. And they could work on these common problems together if they got together. And I started campaigning on this in Washington. And the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Bill Colby, who was a friend of mine after he retired, helped me. And when I came back from North Korea, I asked the State Department, do you get any help from the Russians on North Korea? They said no. So I began complaining that CIA KGB cooperation on North Korea should be the first goal. And it turned out, because you see, the Russians had an embassy in North Korea. We didn't have an embassy in North Korea. I thought they would know something more than we did, and they should help us. And in fact, eventually, this did come about. Here is Gates, and here is Primakov. Primakov was an academic who had been put in charge of KGB's foreign policy activities and who had written and assured me that we'll work on non-proliferation with anybody. So here they're talking together in the first meeting between the CIA and the KGB, and what's the topic? It's North Korea. So, and the Americans had said, we're going to start with North Korea, as make sure they are sincere. If they help us on North Korea, we may work on other things, but that'll be the test. So that worked out quite well. Now, another lesson is you can use shared interests to soften conflict. And I had the honor of helping initiate scientific exchange with both China and Iran. Here is Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister under Chairman Mao, and me and BJ, my wife, talking about scientific exchange with the United States. And I solved a small technical, really not a small, a large technical diplomatic problem that made it possible for the Chinese to agree to come at the invitation of the National Academy of Sciences. So this catalyzed scientific cooperation with China. Many years later, in 1998, I took the first scientific delegation to Iran since the time of their revolution. So in both these cases, I had the honor of taking the first scientific delegation to these two countries, and I brought back a delegation from Iran 8 months later, and here you see I'm mating the head of the Iranian Academy of Sciences with the National Academy of Sciences in Washington, and they started a program of scientific cooperation. I know you'll all be relieved to know that it's on peaceful matters only. So shared interests can be important. Now, ideas can also help defend human rights, and supporting human rights in Russia was a very important part of trying to solve the problem of the Cold War. At one point, the Russian Jews asked to go to Israel. Here are some of them, and here's BJ sitting with them. These Jews had asked to go to Israel, and they were refused visas, but worse, they were told, and now you can't even work. So they had lost the right to work. So they started their own scientific seminar, and the question was, how could they be helped? And we invented a system whereby American scientists could say, we've adopted one of these refuseniks, and until he gets his human rights, either to leave or to work, we won't cooperate with the Soviet Union. So this was our effort to help the refuseniks. We also worked to help this man in 5 hunger strikes. This is Andrei Sakharov with Elena Bonner, my wife, and me. Andrei Sakharov invented the Russian hydrogen bomb, but he was a person of great principle, and he later got the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on human rights. In defending human rights, he engaged in 5 hunger strikes. We invented ways of helping him in those hunger strikes, different methods for different ones. For example, at one point, we got the 5 American scientists who were honorary members of the Russian Academy to quit over the issue of defending Andrei Sakharov. So defense of human rights is a very important matter. Now, many of these projects took a lot of work and a lot of time, but actually, sometimes you can achieve interesting things with virtually no work at all. So that's an important lesson. I was writing a newsletter. Here's the FAS newsletter. I was at the time president of the Federation of American Scientists, on privacy in American life, on eavesdropping and mail covers. And I wrote the chief postal inspector and said, do you ever open the mail illegally without a court order? He wrote back a long letter which basically said no. Now this was not true. And he knew it was not true. Guess why he knew it was not true? His last job had been in charge of the mail opening project of the Central Intelligence Agency, opening the mail illegally. And why was he the chief postal inspector? Well, the Central Intelligence Agency had decided who could be better at providing cover for our illegal operation than to have our man as chief postal inspector. But this letter alarmed Cotter. And so Cotter communicated with Helms. Helms was head of the Central Intelligence Agency under Nixon. And Cotter said, look, I don't work for you anymore. You got to cut it out. He thought that I might know more than I did. And the CIA had a top secret meeting of officials discussing how much does Stone really know? Should we stop this program? Why did he send this letter? They decided to continue in this illegal operation, but to keep careful watch and to stop it if it seemed to be about to blow up in their face. 2 years later, I got a call from a science reporter who said, it's now been revealed from a Rockefeller Commission investigation that the CIA was illegally opening the mail and that it was all stopped because of a letter sent to them by a scientific organization. They said, this was probably you, wasn't it? I said, yes, I guess it was. That was the first I heard about it. So 2 years later, this single letter had so alarmed the bureaucracy that in a complicated dance, which I don't have time to explain now, but which is highly humorous, they decided to stop it. Now, these were big events, but I wanted to tell Swarthmore students that in a small conflict, you can have extraordinary influence because there aren't so many people working on it. You can read all the books on it, you can learn everything, you can become an expert, you can get access to all the officials in the country. And I want to say the 4 things I did on the Cambodian Civil War. So first I want to explain what the Cambodian Civil War was all about. During the Vietnamese War, here's Cambodia right here. Here's Vietnam to the right, Laos on top, Thailand in the back. During the war in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese sent forces down through Cambodia here so that they weren't inside Vietnam, so they couldn't be bombed in going into South Vietnam. Nixon and Kissinger decided to secretly start bombing that area to prevent this. They had to do it secretly because Cambodia was a neutral country and the Congress didn't know that the bombing was going on. The trouble with the bombing was it destabilized all of Cambodia, and a small group of crazy communists in this part of the country, the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmer, took over the country, emptied the cities, and if you've seen the Killing Fields movie, you know that they began killing Cambodians. They killed a couple million over the next 3 years while they were in power. As their government started to topple, they decided to invade a Vietnamese village, to provoke fighting with Vietnam, to help get the Khmer to hold together. The Vietnamese were having none of it. They invaded Cambodia and they pushed the Khmer Rouge back into the jungle. And they set up a kind of a puppet government with Khmer Rouge head of it that had defected from the killing and didn't support the killing. And it was led by a man named Hun Sen. I went there and met with Hun Sen. He looked a lot better than the Khmer Rouge to me. I went to the back of Thailand to find out what was going on, and I met this reporter, Nate Thayer. He was a brave young man, and he would go into the jungles and talk to the Khmer Rouge. He knew all about what was going on, but he couldn't publish it because the Thais would have thrown him out. The Thais were backing the Khmer Rouge, and they didn't want revealed what was happening. But Nate explained to me that the CIA was running a small covert war against the Hun Sen government to throw him out. That CIA operation was coordinating a royalist faction, a democratic faction, and the Khmer Rouge. And my belief was that if this CIA coordinated war succeeded in throwing out the Vietnamese installed government, the Khmer Rouge would promptly swallow up the democratic faction and the royalist faction, who were quite weak, and take over the government and start the genocide again. So I began working day and night for 3 years trying to prevent this from happening. And Nate couldn't write about this for fear he'd be thrown out of Thailand. So I purchased the information from him, and I wrote an article in the New York Times called Secret U.S. War in Cambodia. I didn't really write it. I have to admit, this was Nate's work, but he couldn't sign it, so I signed it. I published it there. For reasons that are described in my memoir that are somewhat complicated, it was undercut in several ways, and the editor said to me later, "You know, Jeremy, Washington is brain dead. This is not going to have any effect." And I think in retrospect, I should have taken this information, which was extremely detailed about exactly what was going on and quite new, and given it to the Washington Post or the New York Times, and not tried to publish it myself. If they had had it, it would have been a front page story and would have rocked the city. So in retrospect, I think I should not have published this myself. The next thing that happened was that this man, Congressman Solars, who ran the House Subcommittee on Cambodia, wanted to offer weapons to the three factions, or at least two of the three factions, to accelerate the war against the Hun Sen government. I considered this would lead to a second Indo-Chinese war, because first you send the weapons, then you send the advisors, then you send troops. We'd be back in the soup again. I went to Senator Cranston, here he is, and I said, "Alan Cranston, you run the subcommittee in the Senate that is the counterpart to the subcommittee that Solars ran. You should have hearings on this, and you should stop this." And he did have hearings, and he did stop it. He got 33 senators to oppose getting overtly involved in the Cambodian War. Now, after a while, the four factions, the three factions trying to overthrow Hun Sen and Hun Sen, were getting together under the pressure of major powers. Here they are, getting together, and they were having a lot of trouble getting agreement on how to end the war. And the great powers were forcing them together, trying to get them, to agree on something. And they were squeezing out like an amoeba, you force it out one way, it comes out another way. I was in Russia at a memorial for Andrei Sakharov, and I went to see the Assistant Secretary for the Far East in the Foreign Ministry. And I told him a story about a dog and a chicken. The lesson here is that metaphors can be quite helpful. I said, if you have a chicken and a fence, and there's food on the other side, the chicken will peck at that fence and it'll starve to death before it does anything different. Dogs are smarter, and they will walk around and they'll see there's no side to this fence and they'll get the food. I said, you guys are behaving like chickens. You're trying to force these Cambodians together. You should step back, let these four factions work it out by themselves. They can do it. They've been fighting with each other for a very long time. He said, that's a great idea. I'll tell the Chinese, you tell the Australians. So we did that. And pretty soon, the vice premier in China, Chen Chi-chen, said, the time has come for Cambodian chefs to make Cambodian cuisine, which was a very Chinese affirmation of what I had in mind. And the Australian Foreign Ministry was writing me through the embassy in Washington, it seems we've taken your idea. So this was an accomplishment. They did reach agreement, but then there had to be an election, and that needed money to solve the election. And the question was how to get the money from the Congress. It required $250 million. I had an idea, and I wrote Hun Sen. Here he is in front of my house in Washington with me and my wife and his wife. I wrote Hun Sen. I said, look, we'll host you in Washington if you come at the time of the congressional debate, and you can help persuade them to give the money to Cambodia to settle the war. And the State Department gave the visa and gave me an armored limousine to take him all around Washington, and even to take him up to New York to see the Secretary General. And the Congress gave the $250 million, and I feel that Hun Sen's visit was an important part of it. Now I want to talk about principles of persuasion. Remember, these are lessons learned for the students. So, catalytic ideas have to be simple. This is about the fifth idea I had that reached a US-Soviet summit. No one you will ever meet has anywhere near that record. There was a treaty that was about to be ratified called SALT II. And it had 5 limitations on armaments. And I was pitching the idea that as a follow-on treaty, they should just lower these limits 2%, 3%, 4% a year, something like that. Brezhnev and Jimmy Carter could decide what percentage they wanted. But I was saying, look, if it's stable and can be ratified at one level, you reduce it by 2% on each side, it can't become unstable. So this is a simple way to follow on this treaty. So Jimmy Carter did propose this in secret to Brezhnev, handed it to him on a yellow pad. I'd been told by a high assistant secretary in the State Department earlier, Jeremy, no one's going to like your idea except you and Jimmy Carter, which turned out to be completely right. I published it in the Washington Post, and he took it up. And Senate Foreign Relations Committee also adopted it unanimously without knowing that Jimmy Carter had already proposed it at the summit. Unfortunately for this idea, the SALT II agreement itself failed because the Russians invaded Afghanistan. The détente was over, and with the failure of détente, the ratification of SALT II couldn't occur, so my shrink SALT II idea couldn't follow. Here's a letter I wrote Jimmy Carter sometime later, and he said, Jeremy, at the bottom he wrote, I still think this is a good idea. Best wishes, Jimmy. Now I want to say something about persuading bureaucracies. If you want to persuade a bureaucracy, you have to infect it, and you have to be memorable. Infecting it means you have to find somebody inside the bureaucracy that likes your idea, and you have to describe its advantages to them. You have to explain how it could be sold in the idiom of that government, so how it would sound optimally in the bureaucracy. And then you have to drop out and say, if you like this idea, it's your idea. I was meeting with a very high official in China. He was a deputy prime minister. There are only 4 such people, it's very high. And I said, you know, I can explain to you the strategy of the Taiwanese. The Chinese were very much afraid that the Taiwanese were going to declare independence and they would have to invade Taiwan. And I was trying to do something about that. I made 12 visits to Taiwan and 12 to China in this century working on this problem. And I said to him, you know, the way to understand the position of the Taiwanese is to remember a fable of a Tang Dynasty emperor with a sick horse. This is a Tang Dynasty horse. The Tang Dynasty emperor had a horse he really valued, and he told everybody, everything must be done to save my horse. And if the horse dies, whoever advises me that the horse is dead will be killed by imperial decree. Now, the Chinese love stories about ancient Chinese emperors, and so I knew that this story would go right through the whole bureaucracy. And I explained that the relationship between Taiwan and China was very similar to the relationship between the emperor and the people that were trying to deal with the sick horse. I won't explain to you the entire fable, but I knew that this would really work in getting through the bureaucracy. And later, since this is a talk to Swarthmore students, I should say that I became famous in China for another analogy. I told this deputy prime minister that the Independence Party might win the next election, which was something the Chinese were very frightened about. He said, no, the Taiwanese people want status quo. They will not elect the Independence Party candidate. I said, well, Vice Premier, actually, the KMT, the ruling party, they've split into 2 parts. And the Independence Party is a third party. And it doesn't need a majority to win the election. It can win the election with a like 37%. I said, for example, I know this very well because when I graduated from Swarthmore College, 3 people stood for election as president. 2 of them were football players. I was a mere cross-country runner, something of lesser status. But the football players divided the football player vote, and I am the president of the senior class of Swarthmore College. And he said, oh, you think the KMT are football players, huh? But the point was, the message would certainly get through with a memorable anecdote like that. You have to use ideas sometimes with intermediaries. There were great fears about North Korea selling its fissionable material to terrorists. And this, something had to be done about this. I speculated and confirmed by talking to physicists that if we found a piece of uranium that came from North Korea, we could tell it came from North Korea. All uranium doesn't look exactly alike. And the same thing was true about the plutonium made in their plants. So I wanted to tell the North Koreans, you guys better not sell fissionable material, because if the United States finds some uranium or plutonium that came from you, they'll bomb the bejabbers out of you. So I couldn't go back to North Korea because I had testified against them after my first visit, but I found intermediaries that did go to North Korea, and I told them, tell the North Koreans they're in big trouble if they sell this stuff. So this was a way to use intermediaries to convey an idea. Another such method of intermediaries involved a time when Jimmy Carter actually prevented a war in Korea. There was a big dispute at one point between the North Koreans, here's their leader, Kim Il-sung, and the White House. And at a certain moment, this is an amazing story I'm going to tell you. At a certain moment, a war party was in place in the White House, the president, the vice president, secretary of defense, and an expert on North Korea. And they were debating, what are we going to do about the possibility of a war with North Korea? And the secretary of defense said, you know, we should be removing dependence, and we should be reinforcing the forces. But if we do that, they will have a reaction, and we could be on the slippery slope to another war, similar to the Guns of August by Tuckman about World War I. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and one of the aides said, Mr. President, Jimmy Carter is in Pyongyang, and he would like to talk to you. So President Clinton said, Gallucci, he said to the North Korean expert, take the call. So Gallucci went out, came back. He said, President Carter has reached agreement with Kim Il-sung on what's to be done about this crisis, and in 5 minutes, he's going to go on CNN and explain his idea, and that he's reached agreement with Kim Il-sung. So Clinton said, Gallucci, you told him not to do that, didn't you? And Vice President Gore chimed in, Gallucci, you told him not to do that, didn't you? And Gallucci said, look, he's a former president. I can't talk to him like that. So there was a pained silence, and then Gore said, well, maybe we better turn on the television. So they turned on the television and watched what happened. And then Gore said, well, maybe we should make lemonade out of this lemon. And they adopted the agreement with one small change to make sure Jimmy Carter couldn't take credit for it. And then when he came home from North Korea, they didn't invite him to the White House. So this is a very memorable story. And when I was talking to a high official in the Chinese Foreign Ministry, I said, look, this problem of getting agreements with North Korea is very difficult. I said, you should follow the example of Jimmy Carter. Why don't you reach agreement with the North Koreans and then tell the Americans we're going on CNN in 5 minutes, we're going to announce it. So the man I was talking to said, this is a very valuable idea. Is it patented? I said, no, if you like this idea, it's your idea, which was what I normally said in such circumstances. Now, there are dangers to political activism. Early in my career in Washington, when I was running the Federation of American Scientists, which had been formed by the original atomic scientists to prevent the use of nuclear weapons, I wrote a report about this man, Johnny Foster. He had been head of the Defense Research and Engineering branch of the Pentagon, the third highest official in the Pentagon, for about 10 years. I read all his testimony over 10 years to the Armed Services Committee. It was a mishmash of misleading and contradictory remarks. all designed to persuade the Senate Armed Services Committee that the Russians, who were in fact far behind us, were getting ahead of us and that more money should be allocated to the Pentagon to stay ahead of them. This paper I released got a lot of attention. Herblock, the famous cartoonist, wrote this cartoon saying, more money, the Russians may be outspending us. And the Armed Services Committee started an investigation. And the reporters were calling me up and saying, finally, some light is being, the Venetian blinds of the Pentagon are being opened. So this was getting a lot of attention, and the White House decided to retaliate. This man, Colson, ran a dirty tricks operation in the White House. He's the man that wanted to start a fire in Brookings so that when the fire engines came, they could sneak in and steal stuff. So he was quite a brainstormer. He decided to have me smeared by this guy, Joseph Alsop, a famous right-wing, very right-wing columnist. And so he got Alsop to smear me in 600 newspapers where Alsop's article ran. Alsop called me an exceedingly left-wing political scientist from Princeton. All of that was wrong. I was a mathematician from Stanford, and I wasn't exceedingly left-wing. I was sort of a garden variety liberal. But it also said that really he's only attacking Johnny Foster because the Russians want to get him out of the way, which is to say Jeremy's a traitor working for the Russians. And he suggested I was a communist for the last 20 years. So this was a pretty savage attack. Fortunately, scientists in America, 3/4 of them are liberals, and they didn't care what Joseph Alsop said. If I'd been running an organization of engineers, that would have been the end of me. 90% of the engineers are conservative, and they would have taken this more seriously. Now, you have to find a base for activism. I did the work on the ABM without a base, just as an academic. But in 1970, I descended from the executive committee of the Federation of American Scientists to running the place. It was very defunct. Its budget was $7,000 a year. I rented a room in the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and tried to rebuild the organization. This, of course, is the legislative arm of the Quakers. And after a while, we had our own building, and even 5 buildings, and I had a small group of people, that's me there, and some staff. Eventually, after 30 years of running the organization, the budget went up to about $1 million. So it wasn't enormous, but it was something. But what I learned when I retired from that at age 65 was that it was extremely easy to set up your own base, which I didn't know. Instead of taking over a defunct organization, I could have started my own. I did start my own. I started an organization called CATALYTIC Diplomacy. I learned it would only take me 3 weeks to set up the organization, and that it was tax deductible from the get-go, and that it only had to deal with the IRS within 18 months to certify that it was tax deductible. And so I discovered you could have an organization so small that it only had 3 on the board. You could be one of them, and you could be the sole staff. I've been running such an organization now for 15 years. And actually, I've been twice as effective as I was before. For example, 30 years of work are described in this book, Every Man Should Try, and that meant there are 30 chapters in there. So I had one exciting adventure worth telling for each year. But when I did catalytic diplomacy, in 7 years, I made 40 country visits, and I wrote a book of these adventures, and there were 15 adventures in 7 years, which is 2 a year. So I was twice as effective without staff. So this is something that young activists should know. Now, finally, I want to say this. The first goal of Quakers has been peace. That was their idea from the very beginning. Lucretia Mott is an example of it, and Swarthmore was founded by Quakers. For the first 70 years, every member of the Board of Managers was a Quaker. So I was startled and upset to discover that the program on peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore didn't even offer majors in peace and conflict studies, only minors. Whereas 40 other colleges listed on a website called peacecolleges.org were giving majors in peace and conflict studies. Now, I'm the only living alum from Swarthmore College that has an honorary degree for his work in peace. So I feel I have the standing to tell the college that this is not acceptable, and that you can't send students out to save the world with a minor in peace and conflict studies. and that the world is falling apart and needs peace activism more than just about anything else. And so they should start supplying this program with 2 tenure-track professors so they could give a regular major. And at this point, they have no tenure-track majors and 1 assistant professor full-time on a 3-year contract. So this is not enough. They have a program made up of part-time people from different disciplines, but they should be giving a major in peace and conflict studies. So in conclusion, I am not going to rest, and you should not rest until the college starts offering a major in peace and conflict studies. Thank you.